Okay, let's pick up with American foreign policy from 1877 to 1912. I began the first screencast with this slide and I have since revised it, so please use this version when you are referring to the lecture outline, and I'll make sure I put this version of the PowerPoint on Moodle. Before we move on to the Panama Canal, we need to type some loose ends with the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was ended by the Treaty of Paris that was signed in December of 1898 under McKinley. In this treaty, Spain recognized Cuba's independence and for a payment of $20 million also ceded the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the U.S. Now, I mentioned earlier about the Philippine-American War that followed the Spanish-American War, and I'll get back to that in just a second. But with the Treaty of Paris, the United States really established an empire for the first time, became a global power rivaling other European nations, and its colonies and protectorates stretched from the Caribbean to the Pacific Ocean. One of the major locations of the Spanish-American War was Cuba. And so the Platt Amendment was introduced by Republican Senator Orville Platt to help govern Cuba after the Spanish-American War. He was a staunch supporter of high tariffs and American expansionism, and the Platt Amendment stipulated the conditions for U.S. intervention in Cuban affairs and permitted the U.S. to lease lands for a naval base in Cuba, and you know this better today as Guantanamo Bay. This amendment virtually made Cuba a colony or a territory, but it was officially a protectorate where the United States was helping to protect Cuba's interest. And the U.S. government also forced a particular version of a constitution that the Cubans didn't have much choice but to adopt. The U.S. also used the Platt Amendment to intervene in Cuban affairs, again for their quote-unquote protection, in 1906, 1912, 1917, and 1920. Rising Cuban nationalism is ultimately going to lead to the abandonment of the Platt Amendment in the mid-1930s, but the United States did retain and still does retain its lease on Guantanamo Bay. A couple other loose ends we need to tie up. One is two guys that were involved in the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo and George Dewey. Emilio Aguinaldo is the Philippine leader who led the insurrection against the Spanish, and then later, once the Philippines are independent of Spain, he leads an insurrection against the Americans. He is going to attack U.S. forces led by Admiral George Dewey, who was a naval commander. So when you hear the name George Dewey, you should associate it with the Philippines. Aguinaldo actually established a republic in the Philippines and named himself as president, and is going to lead forces that fight the United States from 1899 until his capture in 1901. After his capture, the United States is going to pass the Philippine Government Act of 1902, which is also known as the Organic Act, and this is going to make the Philippines an unorganized territory of the United States. So again, sort of in the protectorate status, but it was actually named a territory of the United States. The guy in charge of helping to oversee the administration of the Philippines was none other than William Howard Taft. This is part of how William Taft is going to gain his political credentials that will eventually lead him to be the named successor of Roosevelt. And then another thing I need to mention that's not on the outline, but I want to mention it quickly, is the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, which deals with Japan. This was an informal agreement between the United States and Japan, who were themselves creating an empire in Korea and French Indochina and parts of China. And in this agreement, it said that the U.S. would not impose restrictions on Japanese immigration. Remember, they're having a lot of debates over immigration in the United States. So they would not impose restrictions on Japanese immigration if the Japanese government did not allow further immigration to the United States. So the goal was to reduce tensions between these two nations. All right, one last thing before we get to the Panama Canal, we need to mention two other important guys, John Hay and Alfred Thayer Mahan. John Hay was the Secretary of State under McKinley and Roosevelt, and he's best remembered for the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which is the treaty that helped paved the way for Americans to take over the building and the control of the Panama Canal. And he's also going to help broker the open door policy with China. Now, as you may remember from world history, China didn't want to necessarily trade with anybody, but there were a few agreements that they were forced to sign, and this was one of them, the open door policy that forced China to open some of its ports to the United States. Alfred Thayer Mahan was another big pro-imperialism guy, and he wrote a lot and spoke a lot and helped to unify popular support behind the idea of creating an American empire. He said that in order to do this, or that the United States needed to build a large and powerful navy to protect U.S. economic interests, not necessarily to wage war, but to help protect the interests that we had. Let me go quickly to a website here. If you look up at the top, there was a widely held belief that the U.S. needed ships, not to make war, but to protect its right and prestige. And this is also alluding to nationalism, which we know is a huge theme in the late 1800s. Mahan was a strategist, a historian, and was an advisor, close advisor to Teddy Roosevelt. And Mahan essentially argued three things: that one, we needed to build a really powerful navy to protect our economic interests. Two, this navy could also help increase the production demanded from U.S. goods and help expand our overseas markets. And third, that we also needed this navy to make sure that no nation owned any islands within 3,000 miles of the west coast. So this was also used to justify continued control and influence over Hawaii and the Philippines. So these two guys are both going to be major players in American imperialism. And now the Panama Canal. Teddy Roosevelt here visiting the Panama Canal, you see him sitting there in the middle, and we watched some primary source footage of this as well. It was seen as an industrial feat and another sign, much like the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, that the United States was the industrial and now imperial powerhouse of the world. Teddy Roosevelt had the famous quote, "I took the canal zone." Well, here's what he meant by that. The canal zone, the Panama Canal had already actually, construction had already started on the Panama Canal. The construction was started by the French, who had negotiated with the Colombians. Now, Panama was at that time part of Colombia, and so the French had begun building a canal, but because of poor planning and disease, mostly malaria, among the workers, construction problems, and inadequate financing drove the project into bankruptcy in 1889. The main figure, the CEO of the company, the French company, was Philippe Bonal Varilla, and he helped ensure a deal, promised a deal with President Teddy Roosevelt. So Congress authorized purchase of the French company's rights and construction of the Panama Canal. But it got a little bit more complicated after that. The Panama, as I mentioned before, the Panama was part of Colombia. Well, before that, it was part of Spain. So, excuse me, Panama had been part of Spain was part of Spain until 1821, and then after that time joined in a union with several other Central and South American countries called Gran Colombia. And so after that Gran Colombia split up, Panama was still under the authority of Colombia. So in an effort to try to gain rights to the Panama Canal Zone, the United States passed what was called the Hay-Herran Treaty, and this is one of your IDs. And this was a treaty signed in 1903 with the United States, and then they sent it down to Colombia, controlling what is now Panama. Had it been ratified, it would have allowed the United States to a lease of a 6-mile wide strip across the Isthmus of Panama. And although the United States ratified it, the Colombian government did not. And so the United States was not willing to renegotiate the treaty with Colombia, and they didn't want to alter the amounts or do really any further mediation, and so instead it gave its support to some of the Panamanian groups who wanted to rebel and against the Colombians and create independence. So much like Cuba and the Philippines, the United States helped to spur an uprising in Panama, where the natives there in Panama fought against the Colombians for independence. We came in and helped the natives, and then once we kicked the Colombians out, we came in and said, all right, so now you've got your independence, and this is how we want you to run your government. And the biggest thing we wanted from the newly independent Panama were the rights to the canal zone. And so it was at that point that we began building the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal took several years to build. The United States took it over in 1906 and finished it in 1914, and retained control of it in full until 1977. And it was at that time that President Jimmy Carter signed a treaty that gave 60% back of the canal zone back to the Panamanian government. And then the rest of the rights, the other 40%, were given back to Panama in December of 1999. So today it still is a neutral waterway, but is controlled by the government of Panama. So we did control it for about 100 years, but no longer. This is part of the American imperialism where Teddy Roosevelt enters the scene after the assassination of McKinley and is going to not only build the Panama Canal, but going to, in many ways, change the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, as I mentioned before, was the main foreign policy of isolationism that had been passed after the War of 1812. The biggest thing that Roosevelt did to the Monroe Doctrine is he added what's known as the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904. In some ways, this was to clarify American foreign policy, but also to send a message to European countries who were also scrambling for colonies in Africa and Southeast Asia and the Middle East. The Roosevelt Corollary was an added stipulation to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, as a reminder, the Monroe Doctrine had warned other European powers after the War of 1812 not to meddle in affairs in Latin America or the Western Hemisphere. The Roosevelt Corollary announced that in some circumstances the U.S. did have the right to intrude, and included Latin America. Said if you intrude in Latin America, we're including that as part of our affairs. The initial reason for the Roosevelt Corollary was in 1904, after several European nations had threatened to invade the Dominican Republic and then Haiti. And Teddy feared that American interests were in jeopardy. So the corollary justified the U.S. running the Dominican Republic and also intervening in situations later in Venezuela and Mexico, and it also in some ways justified what had just happened in the Spanish-American War. Now I want to pull up this website quickly that is also going to reiterate what I just mentioned with the Roosevelt Corollary. And I've already talked about the Dominican, but also the Venezuelan government had also defaulted on its debts to foreign bondholders. And so the United States felt like European countries such as the British, the Germans, and even the Italians were going to intervene in Latin America and undermine America's dominance in the region. And so this is where the United States is going to shift gears and in some ways become an international police power, at least in the Western Hemisphere. And if you look at this last line, this is the policy that began the phrase most closely associated with Roosevelt and foreign policy, which is speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far. His foreign policy is also called Big Stick Diploma. And if we look, this is the most famous political cartoon that deals with Roosevelt and his approach, meaning we're not going to start anything, but if you mess with us, we carry a big stick. All right, I'm going to pause right there, and we're going to wrap things up with James Blaine and Pan-Americanism, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson.